To join us, and we have reliably been informed that there are those who are going to join us shortly. But in the interest of time, we felt that we need to start with the proceedings. And we are also aware that there are quite a number of people who would have loved to be with us here, but due to other commitments elsewhere, they are going to follow the proceedings online. And I should also indicate that this also includes our Vice Chancellor and Principal, Dr. Bernard Ntambeleni, who would have loved to be here physically, but due to other engagements elsewhere, he could unfortunately be with us physically, but we are aware that he's following the proceedings online. And I should also indicate and remind colleagues that we are having this event when COVID-19 is still with us. So it is a humble request that for the entire duration of this event, we observe all COVID-19 protocols. And it is also a standard practice that when we have events of this nature, we switch off our cell phones or switch them to a silent mode for the entire duration of the event. And the primary purpose of doing that is to enhance the quality of our proceedings. And I think it's also important to be reminded that this is a public lecture by one of our own, Dr. Tsietsi Ramatsekisa. And I think without necessarily going into details, because I know that a provision has been made in the program, on the program, to introduce him, I think it's important to indicate that Dr. Ramatsekisa is one of our own. And I'm sure you'll hear during the introduction the years that he spent at this university. And the theme of this public lecture is human rights in the era of a natural disaster and pandemics. And I think it's also important to indicate that this public lecture is part of the University of Venda series of events that are intended to build up to the university's main event as part of a celebration of our 40 years anniversary. And I'm sure it's common knowledge that the University of Venda is celebrating 40 years of its existence this year, 2022. And as I have already indicated, a series of events have been lined up to build up to the main event that will take place on the 27th of October this year. So on this note, ladies and gentlemen, let me take this opportunity and invite the director of the School of Law in the Faculty of Management, Commerce and Law, Professor Lonius Ndlovu, who will come and give us opening and welcome address, as well as the introduction of our guest speaker. So please join me as I welcome Professor Ndlovu to the podium. Professor Ndlovu, over to you.
Thank you, Program Director, Dr. Zaka. And good morning, colleagues. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and stand before you and execute the role of introducing our guest speaker, who is someone I'm quite familiar with since he was a member of the academy, and we have our paths have actually crossed, I think, since as early as 2005. And then, colleagues, before I introduce the guest speaker, I just want to abuse my privilege here, perhaps, and start with some brief remarks about the thematic areas, and then, just kind of set the tone for the day, and say we obviously would want to welcome Dr. Ramatsekisa to the University of Venda, his alma mater, as Dr. Tsaga has indicated earlier. He happens to have been a student here. He also lectured here and actually worked in the School of Law. And he left, I think, in 2013. I would want to welcome you, Dr. Ramatsekisa, to the University of Venda, and perhaps alert you to the fact that you may have left the University of Venda in 2013. Lots of things have happened, and as you can see, this very venue we are in was not there when you were here, and there are so many other developments that have taken place, and one of them I want to share with you is the fact that we have a new strategic plan which will end in 2025, 2021 to 2025, and then in terms of that strategic plan, it is actually anchored on 4 pillars. Pillar number 1 being engaged scholarship and student-centeredness, which encompasses your traditional teaching and learning, your research issues, your community engagement. And then the second pillar is the entrepreneurial university. It's a thrust that the University of Venda is pursuing, and it's a new issue, really. The university wants to be an entrepreneurial university, so you will find from time to time our thrust now is to make sure that students exit this place not preparing for future employment only, but for preparing for becoming creators of employment. Then the third thrust in terms of the strategy is the thrust relating to linkages, internationalizations, and ensuring that the university is quite visible in that particular regard. And this engagement now, where you are coming, fits in exactly into that very thrust. And then the last thrust relates to governance, which is quite an important thing for most universities, where we're looking at our own governance as an institution, our committees, our council, our senate, and then, of course, looking at us as an institution, how do we relate to the national and international regulatory framework? Are we compliant with the legislation? Are our policies in line, and so on? So I thought I should remark and say, you are coming to the University of Venda in that very context, an institution that's transforming itself into a university, underpinned by those 4 thrusts that I've just highlighted. Very quickly, I would want to remark on the theme that you are going to address us on, which is on human rights in the era of natural disasters and pandemics. And I would want to quickly say, as you are going to address us today, there are quite a number of issues that are really, topical, and one of them is climate change. The other issue being, these very disasters. You are going to address us on natural ones, and perhaps unnatural. I don't know whether we're going to go there. And then, of course, pandemics. And we are talking, you are going to address us today on a day where Kwazulu-Natal is in a state of initially provincial disaster, and then we are aware later other provinces like the Eastern Cape and others, there are issues there, and obviously impacting on the economy, and there's going to be funds to be spent there. What human rights matters are going to be implicated. I don't want to anticipate your address to us, Dr. Ramatsekisa, but being a legal scholar, one is tempted to actually hint at the fact that, these pandemics and natural disasters, if one looks at the Bill of the Rights and the Constitution, you would see that there's quite a number of rights implicated. The main one, if you are talking pandemics, the right to health, and then natural disasters, we're talking right to housing, we're talking right to education. We are aware in KwaZulu-Natal there's quite a number of schools that have been swept away, and some learners are not even attending classes as we speak. So the right to education being affected, the right to a clean environment as well, and the right to human dignity, really. You see people assembling in halls, and obviously their dignity is affected by those very natural disasters. And then my last perhaps digression would be, in light of your lecture and the theme for today, what role do higher education institutions play in mitigating pandemics and in mitigating disasters? Those are the issues maybe one can say remain, thinking points we could actually look at and say, are universities ready to consider maybe reforming their curricula to anticipate these disasters and actually help? And if we are talking about the fourth industrial revolution, we could think of artificial intelligence being used to kind of predict the possible occurrence of these disasters and say, look, what role do higher education institutions like ourselves have to play in that particular regard? Ladies and gentlemen, having digressed a bit and actually kind of having laid down some few thinking points around the theme, let me take this opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Ramatsekisa, who holds an LLM, an LLB and an LLM degrees, LLB and LLM degrees from the University of Venda here, and then a certificate in sports law from the University of Pretoria, and the Doctor of Laws degree from the University of Fort Hare. He was a visiting researcher during the course of completing his LLD, which was titled Separation of Powers and Constitutionalism in South Africa since the promulgation of the 1996 Constitution, a comparative study. We don't know what Dr. Ramatsekisa compared, which countries he compared. We hope he will share that with us later as he speaks. He is an advocate of the High Court of South Africa, a member of the Pretoria Bar Association of Advocates, and then he has been practicing as an advocate for quite a while until certain things that I'm going to talk about later actually happened. And then he also lectured at the University of Venda from 2005 to 2013, as I hinted earlier. And then after that, he left for Fort Hare, where I think he lectured from 2013 until around 2016. And then Dr. Ramatsekisa is a legal analyst who features on TV and radio from time to time, analyzing these legal issues in this area of interest. In 2013, colleagues, very importantly, one rarely introduces someone who advises a minister. For some of us in the academy, we can write, we can publish, we can draft policy papers, but then there's no guarantee that the minister will lend us a listening ear. But here in our midst, we have Dr. Ramatsekisa, who was appointed at some stage by the Minister of Higher Education to serve on the Council of Letaba TVET College. And then in 2014, the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services appointed him as a member of the Magistrates Commission. And then between 2014 and 2015, he was one of the researchers in the Constitutional Justice Project. Colleagues will recall when President Zuma was still in power, he is the one that actually came up and said, the courts are giving judgments, but we are not aware of the impacts of those judgments. And then we would want a study which actually investigates, the issue of judgments and their impact on society. The University of Fort Hare was awarded that, I don't want to call it a tender, but they were the ones that got that job to actually investigate, as the president had hinted, and Dr. Ramatsekisa was one of the researchers on that very project. And then in 2017, he was appointed a director, consultant and researcher in developing policy, a policy framework for the complete independence of or separation of the judiciary from the executive as one of the arms of the state. He then, I've already hinted that he is an admitted advocate who is a member of the Pretoria Bar Association. And then in June 2021, he was appointed as the special advisor to the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, and he currently serves in that capacity. That is what I hinted at earlier, that we are very fortunate today to have in our midst a person who actually advises the minister, and I'm sure the minister listens to his advice. His role is to advise the minister on various departmental issues, speech writing, parliamentary matters, and advising the presidency on issues of national importance, including the Judicial Service Commission and the appointment of judges, commissions of inquiry, international agreements between South Africa and other countries. And I think, colleagues, those of you that have been maybe avid watchers of what transpired at this recent Judicial Services Commission interviews, you would have seen Dr. Ramatsekisa right there, although he was not one of the candidates, but we could see him from time to time arranging the logistics and so on. So, ladies and gentlemen, it was my privilege to introduce our guest speaker, and I now hand over to you, Program Director. Thank you.
Professor Ndlovu, colleagues, may I request that we rise as we welcome Dr. Ramatsekisa to the podium.
This one. Can I close it? Yeah. Thank you, Program Director, Dr. Zaga. It's mixed feelings. You know, I'm excited. I'm at home. Thank you, Prof, for such a very warm introduction. Let me start by saying the Vice Chancellor, I understand, I'm told, that is attending online. The DVC Research and Postgraduate Studies, DVC Teaching and Learning, Corporate Services in absentia. The University Registrar, I think I met him this morning. The Executive Deans, the directors of the schools, professors, lecturers, university workforce, SRC students in general, the entire university community and stakeholders and distinguished guests present here. I greet all of you. Nda. Awusheni. Molweni. Dumelang. Dimacheloni. They always say that one can go to all directions, but at last, the direction to one's home is the best. And indeed, I have navigated to the best direction. That is why I'm here. It all started here. I saw earlier, Mr. Chidada here. We have got a very long history. He played a big role in terms of introducing me to the academic world. He used to invite me to be a tutor in most of his classes. And it was in that process that I started, enjoying lecturing. And I pursued my master's studies. And I applied for a position at the School of Law. I think officially it was in July 2005 as a lecturer. I would encourage that the institution must intensify the tutorship programs so that they can develop the new breed of young academics to take the fort forward. This is a very good project. If it was in that project, or if the university policy did not allow that, I don't think I would have been where I am. I want to repeat that I would not be standing before you here today if there was no University of Venda. I belong to this family, and wherever I go, I keep spreading the word that I'm from University of Venda, proudly so. I was very excited to receive this invitation from the place of birth of my career. The only problem I had is when I read the invitation, I realized that they are saying I must come and deliver a public lecture. I have never delivered one before, despite presenting papers in conferences. I understood the theme, but again, I had a problem that I'll be addressing the academics. You know, in terms of their traits, they are very analytical. You know, professors are here, everything you're saying, I don't want to leave a public lecture and then everyone will be asking us to, what was he really saying? I will try to be, as much as I can, to be, practical. I had to comfort and counsel myself, and I said it all started at UNIVEN. Now I have to come to my roots and talk to my family members, the UNIVEN community, about issues that affect us all, and these are issues of human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to leave this hall, as I said, with my family members not understanding the purpose of me being here, not understanding the purpose of this public lecture. We have gathered here today as a family on the eve of the Freedom Day. I urge all of you that let us use this Freedom Day to reflect the 25 years of our Constitution. Let us ponder, let us reflect deeply and ask ourselves the following questions. Is this Constitution still relevant and responding well to the problems of the South Africa of today? Is our Constitution protecting all who live in the country from all manners of heinous crimes? Is our Constitution empowering our justice system to be more effective, or is it paralyzing it? Is our Constitution a good document to deal with the industrialized corruption which has now spread like a cancer, which is at the last stage? I know that politicians have different opinions and views on this matter. Some argue that the Constitution needs to be reviewed entirely to respond adequately to the challenges of South Africa of today. Some argue that constitutionalism or constitutional supremacy was a bad idea. We need to go back to parliamentary sovereignty. And I always say to those who are in favor of parliamentary sovereignty that they quickly forget where we come from. They quickly forget the injustices brought by the system of parliamentary sovereignty. Some politicians, like the minister I work with, always argue that the Constitution is a good document. The problem is the politicians. The problem is the implementers. They are not doing enough on implementation. Ladies and gentlemen, this Constitution of ours is admired by many in the world. For example, Kenya has borrowed a lot from our Constitution. In fact, when I use the word borrowed, it's just trying to be modest. They copied a lot from our Constitution, and they're doing very well. This shows that we have got a very good document which we can use to advance issues of socio-economic rights and others. The courts have broadened the interpretation of Chapter 2 of our Constitution. There are so many court judgments that talk to issues of human rights that are covered by Chapter 2 of our Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand, as I stated earlier, that a public lecture is meant to be a means for educating the public. Public lectures help with engagements in communities, alumni, or students, share knowledge, inspire donors, or attract future students. At the same time, we also use them to discuss topical issues confronting us in our daily living. The theme of the engagement today is human rights in the era of disasters and pandemics. It is my assumption that this theme is influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic. As if COVID-19 pandemic was not enough, we now have the floods that swept many of our people in the province of Kwazulu-Natal and the parts of the Eastern Cape. Many people died, many people are still missing, many people are displaced. I will not forget to mention the disasters that are man-made and that which amount to gross violation of human rights, like the Russian-Ukraine war. Irrespective of who might be right or wrong, war will never fix any problem. When the so-called superpowers contest for whatever reason, they do it at the expense of small and developing countries in many instances. And that is what we are seeing today in Ukraine. Innocent people are being killed. Women and children displaced. All the above is a clear indication that there is a need to protect human rights from all fronts by all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, if you follow history and enjoy reading, you'll know that in 539 BC, Cyrus the Great, after conquering the city of Babylon, did something that was totally unexpected. He freed all slaves to return home, and he declared that people choose their own religion. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay tablet containing his statements, is said to be the first human rights declaration in history. This idea of human rights spread quickly to countries like India, Greece, and eventually Rome. We all know that Rome was also very instrumental in terms of its civilization, in terms of the spread of the law concepts and other things. But that did not end there. There were other advances since the time of the Cirrus cylinder. 1215, we had the Magna Carta, the very famous Magna Carta, that gave people new rights and made the king subject to the law. 1628, we had the Petition of Rights, set out the rights of the people. 1776, we have the United States Declaration of Independence that proclaimed the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 1789, we had the Declaration of the Rights of Men and of the Citizens. That is a document of France stating that all citizens are equal under the law. More importantly, in 1948, we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the first documents listing the 30 rights to which everyone is entitled. After the Second World War, governments then committed themselves to establishing the United Nations with the primary goal of bolstering international peace and preventing conflicts. People wanted to ensure that never again would anyone be unjustly denied life, freedom, food, shelter, nationality. The essence of these emerging human rights principles was captured in President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 1941 State of the Union address. He spoke of the world founded on 4 essential freedoms: freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from want and fear. The calls came from across the globe for human rights standards to protect citizens from abuses by their governments, standards against which nations could be held accountable for the treatment of those living within their borders. The voices played a critical role in the San Francisco meeting that drafted the United Nations Charter in 1945. Now, with all this background, when I looked at the topic, I said, maybe let me just try to unpack the elements of the theme. The first question which I asked myself is, and also attempted to answer, is, what is human rights? The traditional definition has always been that human rights are the basic rights and freedoms that belong to every person in the world from birth until death. Human rights are standards that recognize and protect the dignity of all human beings. They govern how individual human beings live in society and with each other, as well as their relationship with the state and the obligation that the state have towards them. Human rights are inherent, universal, inalienable, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. Ladies and gentlemen, you will agree with me that in terms of our history, the history of South Africa, all along, what political organizations used to fight for, it was these human rights. Hence, we had the charter that came out as a result of the meeting which was held in Kliptown. You will remember that that charter also borrowed a lot from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But in essence, that charter played a role at the time of the CODESA negotiations, the first CODESA and the second CODESA. It is at that time that stakeholders which were busy with the engagement to pave our way to a democratic country agreed on the interim constitution. It was not an easy road because there were so many detractors. Some political organizations left the discussions. Some will remember Eugene Terblanche when he invaded the venue. Now, after having described or defined human rights as I did, I also looked at the second element as to what is a disaster. In a dictionary meaning, a disaster can be defined as a sudden accident or a natural catastrophe that causes great damage or loss of life. Disasters are serious disruptions to the functioning of a community that exceed its capacity to cope using its own resources. Disasters can be caused by natural, man-made, and technological hazards, as well as virus factors that influence the exposure and vulnerability of a community. The last element, it was the question of what is a pandemic? On the other hand, a pandemic can be of a disease prevalent over a whole country or the world. You remember that the World Health Organization declared the outbreak a public health emergency of international concern on the 30th of January 2020 and a pandemic on the 11th of March 2020. That was the COVID-19 pandemic. The declaration of a state of disaster was a response to a global health crisis that posed a grave threat to the lives and the well-being of our people. There is no doubt that such a response was necessary under the circumstances. The declaration of the national state of disaster on the 15th of March 2020 empowered the South African government to take the measures that prevented many more people from becoming severely ill and saved countless lives. I know very well that academics and many sectors of the South African community debated a lot when it came to the lockdown restrictions by government. But some were quick to understand that the declaration or these measures were effective in slowing down the rate of infection, easing pressure on our hospitals, and providing the time we needed to develop the infrastructure, resources, and capacity to manage a large number of people who became ill as a result of COVID-19. It is the view of many scholars, and of which I share the same sentiments, that human rights law obliges governments to do some things and prevents them from doing others. Individuals also have responsibilities. In using their human rights, they must respect the rights of others. No government, group, or individual person has the right to do anything that violates another's rights. ladies and gentlemen, it is my view that some measures that have been taken by countries to confront the COVID-19 pandemic have constituted violations of human rights and did not comply with the legal conditions to restrict human rights. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown the ugly fractures in healthcare systems, health inequities, racism, and discrimination, undermining the right to freedom of expression and the right to access information. Gross negligence in protecting detainees from COVID-19 infections. All of this constitutes clear violation of the principles of international human rights law. But out of the theme of this lecture, I convinced myself that we need to judge our government by the manner in which it has handled the issues of human rights during the pandemic. Did they act in the manner that a reasonable government would have acted? Did they limit our rights in a manner that is in accordance or it is within the purview of the limitation clause as appears in our Constitution? The limitation of rights need to be carefully handled within the purview of the limitation clause of the Constitution of South Africa and the international law. Because remember, we have got international agreements that South Africa is a party to, and South Africa needs to comply or adhere to those instruments. Many areas of human rights were affected one way or the other, and this happened in various sectors of communities. You will recall that it was not only in South Africa, it was not only regionally, it was also international that countries acted or reacted differently from this pandemic. Even the countries which we refer as first world countries, they experienced a lot of problems. People revolted against the measures which were introduced by those countries. You will remember countries like Italy, USA, France, Australia. Many people were revolting to say that the government is becoming too harsh in terms of introducing the measures that were meant to curb the pandemic. Amongst other rights that were affected, the freedom of speech and expression. Other countries restricted media reporting because of people coming with different theories and beliefs. You'll remember that when we started hearing about this COVID-19, so many people came with so many theories. That this is man-made, this is because of the battle between China and the US. China wants to be a superpower economically. There were so many theories around it. So some of the countries, in order to curb the spreading of this pandemic, they suppressed freedom of speech and expression. The right to health was also affected. Many patients were turned away from health facilities. Remember is that it is at that time that many countries started coming up with temporary hospitals in order to accommodate the influx of people who were ill at the time. And again, some of the people were turned away because they could not be accommodated by those facilities. So that, in a way, affected that right. Freedom from discrimination. You remember that when it came out that this COVID-19 pandemic started in China, most countries started to discriminate against Asian people. They were discriminated against in the US and other parts of Europe because there was this stigma to say that they are the carriers of this COVID-19. They are the ones who are spreading this. They are the ones who manufactured this COVID-19. So people were unfairly discriminated. Freedom of information. In many countries, I still remember there are countries which censored Twitter or different social media platforms simply because those platforms were the ones which were used to spread the theories of many people. Those who were believing that the COVID-19 pandemic was man-made, those who were believing that this is satanic. When scientists were busy working on the vaccination, there was also a theory that the pharmaceutical companies might have played a role in this so that they can maximize their profits or have to gain in terms of the business of manufacturing vaccines. The right to privacy. You remember that it is at this time wherein there was a mass surveillance in order to carry out contact tracing of the disease spread. I still remember that even in South Africa, they were doing the same. If you cough, you are in trouble, then everyone whom you contacted have to be traced, you have to go for these tests and so forth and so forth. The most worrying one was when you are quarantined. And at the end, after staying for so many days in quarantine, we found that no, actually you are not sick. So that also played a role in terms of affecting the right to privacy. You remember that there was also restrictions on mobility, and that included lockdown and mandatory quarantine due to public health emergency. Based on scientific evidence of limited duration and respectful of human dignity, many people challenged this quarantine method. I still remember in South Africa we had someone who went to court to challenge the Disaster Management Act that the lockdown restrictions were emanating from. That all these levels of the restrictions were unnecessary and they were violating our constitutional rights. But most shockingly, and that is what I've experienced in South Africa, those who are studying law You will agree with me that in terms of the interpretation of statutes, they say the law is created for a purpose. So if the purpose falls away, so the law. So the Disaster Management Act came into place, and the lockdown restrictions were introduced. The levels were introduced. This was solely for the purpose of curbing the spread of the pandemic. I became so worried when I observed that some ministries also wanted to use the lockdown restrictions for other purposes. For example, I started hearing this other department now talking that because of these restrictions, the crime rate went down. That was not the purpose. I heard again this other ministry. I'm not mentioning them by names because I'm partly working for government. So when I go back, the minister I work with will ask me as to what were you actually saying there. This other ministry, I still remember vividly that we're very close to Easter. People could not travel. And people were saying, happy celebrating that we don't have accidents in the road. Yes, it's a good thing. But the lockdown restrictions were not meant for that. So it brought a question to some of the sectors of the community to say, are these lockdown restrictions honestly used to curb the pandemic, or they are aimed at other ulterior motives? You'll remember that pastors were up in arms. They wanted the church to open. You remember that in many functions, in many venues, people will be limited in terms of numbers. The lockdown restrictions were not meant for any of those reasons. They were just meant, as I said, to curb the spreading and of the pandemic and to control the curve, maintain the curve, so that the facilities which we had should be able to accommodate people who needed the hospitalization at the time. Because remember, this pandemic affected us differently. Some indeed needed the hospitalization. Some needed, just to be treated and what we call outpatients. It is this point wherein I realized that indeed Africans, more in particular, are more knowledgeable in terms of treating ourselves with herbs. You go to each and every corner, you'll find people using different herbs in order to deal with this pandemic. We started seeing people steaming, we started seeing people, definitely. So you'll see that all of us, we work together in order to try to control the spread. But most worrying, coming deep to the theme of this public lecture, I've already indicated some of the rights which I don't want to call them essential rights, because in terms of the scholars, they will tell you that rights are rights. There is no smaller rights, there is no bigger right. the preparedness of our government is what we had to assess very closely, because we are staying in a constitutional state. We know and we have seen in various platforms that soldiers and other law enforcement agencies use this opportunity to violate human rights. Not all though, but we have seen some elements. It will be wrong for the government to impose a lockdown and prolong it because of the lack of a solid plan to deal with the pandemic. A strategy and a well-coordinated redirection of resources is key at the era of disasters and pandemics. It does not end there though. The management of those resources is key. I want to be honest here. South African government did its best in protecting human rights in that era. Anyway, we are still in the era. But my observation is that we failed in two aspects. A quick recovery plan was needed. Hence, there was endless extensions of restrictions. Those who follow things, you'll agree with me that some of the countries which were affected, countries like Italy and France, they had a solid plan in terms of how to deal with the spread of the pandemic. After the borders were closed, after they introduced the lockdown restrictions, they were very quick to reduce the number of the people who were suffering from the pandemic. They were able to ease the pressure in their facilities. That is what we mean a recovery plan. So the extension of the lockdown restrictions emanating from the Disaster Management Act were not desirable in a country like ours. But I understand it took longer and it has been extended so many times simply because we did not have a clear plan for recovery. Secondly, there was no clear plan and coordination of managing the relief funds and other resources. This can be seen from the cases that the SIU, Special Investigation Unit, has dealt with so far. And those cases relate to the PPEs. Corruption is the one that has violated human rights in our country than the pandemic itself. How on earth do you steal from the sick? How on earth do you steal from your family members that are in hospital? Because that is what it means. Many companies were awarded these tenders for PPEs while they were not qualifying, while they were not meeting the requirements. And that misdirected the resources. We're told that South Africa got a loan from various institutions, lot of money. And as of today, there is no clear accountability of where those monies went. I know that the SIU is fighting in terms of recovering those funds. But I'm telling you that besides the ones which have been identified, there's still a lot of funds which are still missing. There are still a lot of companies that still need to account. There are still a lot of politicians, government leaders that needs to account. For me, that is a gross violation of human rights we have suffered in this era. Recently, we have heard of the relief fund for the province of Kwazulu-Natal and the part of the Eastern Cape. Instead of coming up with a solid plan of how are we going to coordinate these resources, already comrades are fighting. Already entrepreneurs are fighting for these resources. Is this the kind of South Africa we want to live in? Absolutely no. We see government officials rushing for deviations on treasury regulations in order to give tenders to families and friends. For me, that is a gross violation, as I repeat, a gross violation of human rights in the era of disasters and pandemics. And this made me to agree with one master of public lectures, Professor P.L.O. Lumumba, when he said, corruption has killed many people than what civil wars have killed in Africa. The strength and wisdom of our people and leaders has been and remain tested at the era of pandemics. All sectors of the economy have been tested. The era of disasters and pandemic requires judicial decision-making and public policies for countries to protect public and private health systems, and consequently, the well-being and, in a prior way, the health rights of their citizens. Both at legal and ethical levels, it is desirable that decision-making in public health, which is even more important in a pandemic context, respects the non-derogable guidelines of fundamental human rights. Also, constitutional rights and respects law-guided ethical standards in a way to better protect the health rights of people and to also provide the secure maintenance of healthcare systems. Extreme measures taken by countries and governments are justified in the context of the novel coronavirus infection pandemic by the fact that the disease had a high transmissibility rate and the methods of transmissibility were not completely understood by the scientists at the time. And remember, we also had so many variants. And Today you are told that this vaccine is effective. This is not effective. This vaccine is effective to a certain percentage. Everyone was struggling with a manner to control or curb this pandemic. What we should have done as a country, we should have placed more resources in terms of having a team of scientists that is dedicated on studying the movement and the change of form of this virus. Not to follow what Western countries do. I recall that we also had an embarrassment using public funds. Go and procure vaccinations which were told that they were expiring or they've expired, something like that. Those who can recall, there was a big debate about HIV and AIDS at some time. It took a lot for people to receive treatment. Law students, you'll remember the Treatment Action Campaign case law, wherein the executive was forced to procure treatment. And remember, there's no pandemic that comes without theories. Same as HIV/AIDS came with the same theories, wherein we're told that it was man-made. The companies of the Western countries that volunteered to donate treatment were said to be behind all this, because after their donation, then it means we still have to buy the treatment from them. I still remember the president by then, President Mbeki, argued, and many scholars and scientists did not agree with him. He argued that this HIV/AIDS it's very controversial because the virus does not cause what do you call acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And he was in trouble with many NGOs because of those comments. I still remember when I read one of his articles, he also argued that perhaps we should also look at the social welfare of our people. Because even if you come with treatment, you need a healthy nutrition. For me, it is not much different from what we have been experiencing with COVID-19. People who suffered with COVID-19 also needed better treatment that can boost their immune systems. So if the health facilities are not well equipped, if people are still stealing resources that were supposed to be directed to the health facilities, we are not going to achieve anything. let us thank the government that, at least for now, they've tried to ease things in that they have changed the regulations. We have done away now with these things of levels, and things seem to be going back to normal. But are we going to recover? Because that is what we have to concentrate on. We can't always talk of the actual violation, forgetting to talk about how we're supposed to recover. How are we going to address such violations? How are we going to better human rights from the era where we are coming from? This needs government leaders with vision. I have borrowed again from what I always refer as the Master of Public Lectures, Prof. P.L.O. Lumumba, because when I came here, I told you earlier that I had a problem because this is my first public lecture, so I had to watch a lot of his presentations. And I came across one of his quotes where he says, "A man may be a political animal, but there comes a time in a person's life when true service must be the ultimate goal." It is important that our government must become committed to a true service to our people. In the history of this country, we need this government more than before, today, because many people lost their lives, many people are orphans, many people lost their jobs. This also affects right to education. We all know that education in South Africa is very expensive. We all know that the funding that we get from the NSFAS is not adequate. We need this government more than we did before. As I conclude, it is my view that the most violation of human rights that we have experienced in the eras of disasters and pandemics is the wolves of corruption. If we can deal with corruption and have dedicated leaders, dedicated government, we will be in a better place to recover. It is in the hands of our leaders, it is in the hands of government, it is in the hands of NGOs, it is in the hands of our church leaders and congregations, community organizations, and many other institutions. But more importantly, the respect of human rights it is in my hands, it is in your hands, it is in our hands, it is in the hands of everyone. Me and you and all of us must be judged on what we have done in protecting and advancing human rights in the era of disasters and pandemics. Thank you.
Let's give him another round of applause. Thank you so much, Advocate Dr. Ramatsekisa. For those of you who joined us late, the director of the School of Law, Professor Lonias Ndlovu, when introducing Dr. Ramatsekisa, made it very explicit that Dr. Ramatsekisa is not new to us. And I think I should also indicate or reiterate that Dr. Ramatsekisa studied at this university, and he also lectured in this university before he left in 2013. And I think it's also important to reiterate what the director of the school has indicated earlier on, that it is indeed a privilege for us to have in our midst one of our own, Dr. Ramatsekisa, in his capacity as the special advisor to the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services. And Dr. Ramatsekisa, maybe I should have indicated that we have in our midst the Secretary General of the SRC here, Junior Magagula, who is also in the School of Law, if I'm not mistaken. So we are now moving on with the program. And the next item on our program is questions and comments. And let me request that before you ask your question or you make a comment, please introduce yourselves. So you are now welcome to ask questions and make comments based on Dr. Ramatsekisa's lecture. And I should also indicate that there are also those who are joining us virtually. You are also welcome to participate. Ms. Mupai.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Ramatsekisa. I have two questions. One is I was sent by my administrative law students to pose it to you on their behalf, and one of my own based on your presentation. I'll start with the class question. Their question is, on the separation of powers. They read your introduction and saw that you did your thesis on separation of powers. Now, their question is, on the separation of powers, how effective was it, that separation during the times of the state of disaster, particularly because of the COVID-19, because that was the longest state of disaster. So in your opinion and expertise, how effective was maintaining that separation of powers whilst in the same breath managing the pandemic? And also, if I may add from your speech, because you also did say you observed that there was no solid plan in your observation on the containment of the pandemic. So that is the first question, the separation of powers during the time. And my own, based on your presentation, is concerning therefore the Constitution, particularly Chapter 2, the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Do you think the manner in which the state, the government, managed or handled the whole pandemic issue did help in the promotion or the promotion of the confidence of the citizens of South Africa on the strength of our Constitution? Because you did mention yourself, and as we all know, that our Constitution is hailed as one of the best in the world, to such an extent that you have other countries that actually copy, if we could say bluntly, copy from it. But do you think, therefore, the manner in which we handle the pandemic and even the natural disasters like we see in KZN, has it exposed the strength, or has it really exposed that there is a weakness to this thing that we thought is great, or it's not even the Constitution itself, is the implementers? But my question is, do you think, in your observation, all what happened, how does it leave people in terms of our confidence or their confidence on the Constitution? Because many rights were limited, and some of which you and I can argue whether it was justifiable or not. Do you think it leaves the people on the ground with confidence, or such confidence has been eroded to a point that anyone now can think they can just limit anyone's right when there is a so-called pandemic or a natural disaster? Thank you. Those are my two questions.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Ramatsekisa, let me take two more hands before you respond. SG.
Okay, thank you very much, Program Director, and Dr. Ramatsekisa for the lecture. But mine is a comment which I have. When I was listening to the whole lecture, the problem which we seem to have with this pandemic, or when we're having natural disasters, is how our executive is managing whatever that is given to them. For example, you mentioned the issue of resources being misused in quite a number of times. So I think the first point of departure in that, on how best can we solve, or how best can we prevent funds being misused by the politicians. I think if we were to create a state which is capacitated in dealing away with tenders, that will be the first point which we start with in order to avoid the mismanagement of funds. Because, for example, you find out to have a simple setting like this hall where we are now, to get the banners and everything, for that, if you were to bid for a tender, you put it to be advertised on a tender, just to get those two banners there, it can be ranging around 7,000. And for that, in actual fact, when you're procuring such thing, they are about 2.5. For example, and then if you put it on a tender, it's going to be like 7,000, 8,000. So if we can have a state which is capacitated in making sure that we don't have tenders, the state is able on doing things on their own. If they want to build a city somewhere, the state is well capacitated in having its own people building its own city. If they want to build a new hospital, the state itself, without even going to Nanzo Trading, without going to whatever company that is building, I think that's where we can start. Because everyone here, everyone who's close to politicians is expecting even the politicians to be having money, Some people even come and say, Secretary, we are broke by the SG, how is that even possible? So I can imagine that is also happening to the people who are leading out there. And then if they have an opportunity to go and say we're debating, obviously they will do that. So to prevent that, let's have a state which is capacitated in making sure that we don't have tenders. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me have one more hand before Dr. Ramatsekisa could respond. Oh, there's another hand over there.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Ramatsekisa, the former chairperson of the Law Student Council here at the University of Venda. So thank you very much. And I joined you late, Dr. Ramatsekisa, but I believe that I did catch some of the things. You did indicate that the main purpose of the restrictions during the process of the lockdown was to actually cap the spread of the COVID-19. So I want us to go back to the issue of the government deploying the defense force on the ground. It is my question to you, do you think it was actually necessary, more especially if we are looking at the purpose of those particular implementations and the restriction to cap the spread of the COVID-19, more especially also when we look at what transpired in terms of the violation of some of the non-derogable rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. Let's say, for an example, the right to be free from torture. So it is my question to you. Do you think it was necessary for the government to come up with that particular strategy, more especially if we are looking at the purpose of those particular restrictions and also implementations by the government? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I'm not so sure if you are able to see me. I've got this disability of being. Wait, this the mic. Oh, okay. Once again, I want to repeat that I'm really, really pleased to be here. And when I see the way people are seated, it still reminds me of my early days when I commenced with my lecturing path. Ms. Mpai, I thought maybe you'll also state that you are my product. and a colleague at a later stage. Okay, just going straight to your question of separation of powers. At this era of the pandemic, I want to tell you that our separation of powers emanate from the Constitution. It is not written in words in the Constitution to say that we've got separation of powers. You can read the entire Constitution. There is no wording separation of powers. But the manner in which the drafters of the Constitution drafted the Constitution, it directs that we have separation of powers. It has separated the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. Again, if you have read the certification judgment, the first and the second certification judgments, that is where you'll see that indeed we have this separation of powers. Even though we don't have a universal model of separation of powers, but the model we have suits our situation here in the country. Going back to the question, yes, it was exercised fully, but the other arm of state, parliament, I'll say parliamentarians, some were worried to say that these restrictions, these lockdowns, were not done in consultation with Parliament. And they felt that Parliament should have played a role as one of the arms of state. On the other hand, remember, these restrictions emanating from the Disaster Management Act, the Act itself is the product of Parliament. It's being implemented by the executive. Those who were not happy, they went to court to challenge it. So there were balance and checks in place. That's why I would argue that I think separation of powers in that era or in this era was in full swing, because we also had those checks and balances. Even though we must remember
that these three arms of state plays different roles. Hence, the executive, because they are the ones who are running the country, they were in the forefront. These restrictions were put in place by the executive. The judiciary was complying. You'll remember that we're having courts virtually. Accused people were remanded or they appeared through screens and so forth. Parliament was not sitting. So there was a compliance. And those who were not happy, as I said, that they approached the court. So I think, in my view, that there was separation of powers. Whether a constitution is a good document, I believe that we have got a very, very good document. The only problem, as I said, is implementation. Remember, the Constitution is a guiding document under which the legislature can pass laws to cover so many areas for the purpose of implementation. The executive can still operate under this constitution. There's a debate now about the Section 25 as to whether there was a need to amend it or not, or implementation in terms of addressing the land issue is still doable under Section 35 without being tampered with. Personally, I still believe we can address the land issue without any amendment. Hence, I'm saying we've got a good document, but the problem is the implementation. We have many cases decided by the Constitutional Court based on the very same good document. We've got those cases which even other jurisdictions are still referring to them. They're using them, as a persuasive force in their courts. So for me, the document is good. In our country, the other problem we have is the tendency of fixing that which is not broken. That is the problem we have. If something is right and there is no any other way in which people can, go in and out and do silly things, then that thing is not right. Not to say that is broken. We want to fix things in order to open, cracks so that cockroaches can come in. So the document is a good document. I hope I tried to be straightforward with my answer. Oh, the SG, indeed you speak like the SG, the Secretary General. We are led. You see, what we are raising, you raise it again in other platforms, people will hate you. But that is the truth. And that is the way in which we have to take. That is the way which we have to go as a country. when I was coming this side, I always come this side because obviously I'm from this province. But I saw it, it was like, revived yesterday when I was coming. In the manner in which things are being done in this country, I am not sure if the government will cope again in terms of fixing the infrastructure. The roads are bad. People don't have water. There are so many things which are going wrong. Some of the water projects are stalled, not because there are no funds. People are paid. They go and buy expensive machines and not do the work. The money is being swindled through tendering. And maybe others might say that the tendering system is not a bad idea. What is bad? It might be the people who are tendering. Because we have got roads, which we are still using them today, which white companies went for a tender, but they did quality work. We're still using them even today. Some are just, being depleted simply because now you can see the population growth and there are so many cars. Everyone has got a car nowadays and so forth, so the roads might not be coping and so forth. But those were quality roads. So I would not want to entirely blame it on the tendering system, but I think in the manner in which it is happening in the country, it might be better to do away with the tendering system. And let's see if we can't hire our own people, be full, employed, go. When I grew up, I was not born long ago, but we had public works having so many people building clinics, schools. We had so many people working on the roads. Some of them we used to call, You'll find them, our grannies and our, aunt on the side of the roads, busy collecting stones, doing bridges and so forth. Things were good at the time, but now things have just gone to the west. So, in answering you, I will just say it's two-sided. The tendering system, yes, they introduced it, they wanted to empower our people, but now what is prominent, it's looting and not doing the work. From the former chair, deployment of soldiers, was it really necessary and so forth? You see, the system we are using in South Africa, it's a very delicate system. Constitutional democracy is a very, very delicate system. At all times, you have to mind your step. The government must always be cautious in whatever decision they take. Let us be honest again in the kind of society we are living in. We will always want to be proactive, but the question we have to answer is, are we doing all that within the prescripts of the Constitution? And I just want to give you a practical example. Not so long, we had the so-called July unrest affecting KZN and parts of Gauteng. When I saw that happening within the first 2 days or so, I whispered to my minister to say, I think here we'll need soldiers to be deployed. Because of the manner in which I saw things unfolding, but because our government is a very cautious government, they wanted to be sure that they don't deploy soldiers in a manner that is, hasty and trample on the people's rights. Because remember, soldiers, they don't operate like any other law enforcement agent. They've got their own training, which is different from what the police do. Now, the delay in deploying soldiers in the July unrest, you remember what it cost. And immediately the soldiers were deployed. I was watching on the screen. I could see that they managed within few seconds of their deployment to diffuse the situation. But in the era of COVID-19, at the same time, maybe we might not say here publicly, but it's like everyone was on a mission to cheat the regulations. It's like some of the people were on a mission just to find a way of going to buy alcohol. I remember of trying to cross the borders of the provinces. I still remember this other guy trying to cross the province with a girl in a boot. So with the pressure which the SAPS is facing, they needed to be reinforced, and hence they asked, the president authorized the deployment of the soldiers. I am not condoning at all the treatment that some of the soldiers displayed to the ordinary citizens. But I think, in short, it was necessary to a certain extent. I think I've answered all the questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ramatsekisa. I see there is a hand from your colleague, Bochidada. Yeah. But maybe before then, Bochidada, there is a question which has been texted to us from Douglas Maidula. The question is, what was the constitutional/legal status of the National Coronavirus Command Council in the context of separation of powers? Which arm of government did it represent? Where did it derive its powers in the context of the rule? So maybe, Bochidada, you can now come up with your comment or question.
I am Tsietsi from the School of Law, Department of Criminal Justice. Perhaps I should also indicate or declare, like Dr. Ramatsekisa said, Ms. Mupai should have stated that she's his product. Dr. Ramatsekisa is also my product. And my former colleague, and we are also friends in some other activities. But now my question is, Dr. Ramatsekisa, don't you think some way, somehow, that the governing party took advantage of the lockdown restrictions to crack down on opposition parties in order to pursue its own political agenda when it comes to, for instance, the declaration of the elections date last year, which was held on the 1st of October, 2021. The president of the governing party was all over the screen. Some other parties were not allowed to group or to have their rallies or to can have their members come to their rallies. My second question is around the 350 grant extended as it is by the president. Do you think is that grant of 350 sufficient to address the pandemic mayhem? Thank you.
Thank you. There's another hand over there.
Thank you, Program Director. And pardon me, Dr. Ramatsekisa, I may actually miss your response. I'm rushing to a test. However, I acknowledge what you mentioned about us probably having one of the most beautiful constitutions. However, does it truly address grassroots level issues? Can we truly continue to be a paper trail policy formulation society without dealing with the real issues? Again, I want to believe that the rights that you have touched on during your address or your lecture are rights that are eminent to everyone. But the real pain of any such rights being violated is felt by the men on the ground, again, the grassroots level men. While those who are actually supposed to be the ones ensuring the upholding protection of the very rights continue to be the ones violating those rights through the wolf you mentioned, corruption. What really needs to be done? Thank you.
Thank you. One last hand before Dr. Ramatsekisa could respond to.
Thank you very much, Dr. Advocate Ramatsekisa. I'm his product. He's the one who moved my expert application while admitted as an advocate 2018. Looking into the fact that the minister listened to your advice, why can't you use that platform to assist Kwazulu-Natal on the plan that could be used in allocating the relief funds? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ramatsekisa, over to you.
Thank you. Once more. Let me start by the question that came from the SMS sent. The Command Council, its legal status. Let me be honest. Running government is not easy as one can think. I can tell you, I am in that pot. It is not easy. The minister can't operate without advisors. Same as the president can't operate without the advisors. The last time I checked, can't remember, I think the president had 3 or 4 advisors. The president can appoint councils and so forth to advise him on certain aspects or sectors. The politicians normally, of course, except my principal, who is also a product of this university, Minister Lamula. He's a lawyer by his own right. He's an admitted attorney. So he understands some of the things. I advise him. And it's not an easy task to advise a lawyer, because he always have his own thinking, independent thinking as a lawyer. But remember, the president is not a medical doctor, is not virologist, and all those things. He needed people who were going to advise him, people who are experts in the field. So the Command Council played an advisory role so that the executive must take informed decisions based on science. So it's not that the Command Council was running the country at the time. No, it is not like that. They advised the executive took a decision based on that. You'll find that there are some of the recommendations which they've made which the executive did not accept. So they were not in control, but I can tell you that that council was necessary. Remember, some of the people who went to court, they were challenging these regulations, saying that they were not informed by science. So just imagine if I understand our president is, he studied BU, is it BURIS or BPROC, I can't remember. So he's not an expert in that field. He needed a team, a strong team, because these regulations affected the lives of many people. These regulations, brought the economy down. So he needed the advice, proper advice, in order to take proper decisions. So the Command Council played an advisory role. From Mr. Tsietsi, I can confirm, yes, it's true, we come from very far. Actually, many people thought we're brothers as from the same mother, because I also had Bal at the time. We used to confuse students a lot. I still remember, like what I said when I started here, that this path of lecturing, you are one of the people who really, paved my way, because you used to give me the opportunity to tutor in one of your classes, Introduction to Law. Yeah. So I ended up lecturing that course for a very long time, I think until I left the university. So indeed, I'm very proud of you, and I really feel honored that today you've attended here. And the question you have raised, I'm not a political analyst, but most political analysts I've listened to and watched on television, they share the same sentiment, that these regulations disadvantaged other political organizations, because people who were always seen on the news addressing were politicians who were in the executive positions, and obviously they were coming from the governing party. So the others struggled with airtime. Where will you get airtime when you are locked in your house? Where will you get audience if members of your party are in your house? How are you going to call the media to come to where you are and so forth? But I'm happy that at some extent, the government also came with the idea of introducing these passes to show that you are an essential worker and so forth, and you are doing essential services. And so that at least, it helped in terms of easing other things, because I could imagine that the work of a head of a political organization is very important in that time, because you are representing a particular constituency. And even parliamentarians at the time, I think they also had these permits. So it was better. But trying to answer you, yes, I'm trying to think as what could have been another way of trying to give platform to other political formations, because by the way things were very tense at the time, there was no time of politicking. People were dying. People were becoming ill. So even though they were complaining of getting airtime, but facing the reality is that those who were at the helm were supposed to address the nation and give the nation the confidence. So I think you are right, and I agree to a certain extent, but we needed leaders to give us direction, those who are running the country, the executive authority. 350 will never be sufficient. But I can say that it is better than nothing. What I'm worried with is the manner in which it's being administered. Always when you go to post offices, there you'll find these queues which are unacceptable. The systems always having glitches and so forth. I don't want to go to the issue that some, of course, they're using this 350 for other things, which is not meant as a social relief. But I can tell you that it is assisting so many people. It is not enough, though, but I thank the executive authority that they have seen that it needed to be extended. There was a question which was asked by someone, I think she has left. Yes, I repeat, the constitution we have in the country, it's a good document. But are the people playing their role when it comes to implementation? Just want to give you an example. In South Africa, we've got a problem of law enforcement. We've got many police. We have seen video clips going viral of police doing other things than law enforcement. So will you say we don't have a good constitution or we have got bad cops? That is where the issue is. Look at the issue of xenophobia. Look at the issue of illegal immigrants. I can tell you that those incidents were unnecessary for us to come across or to happen in our country. The Constitution protects the boundaries of this country, protects all the people who are living in this country. The Constitution protects all the people who are coming into the country by legal means. So will you want to blame the Constitution to say we don't have a good document when you're looking at the influx of illegal immigrants who are coming through the borders which are not properly controlled. No. We've got a good constitution, but we don't have good implementers. The issue of the relief fund, the question is, because the minister will always have borrow me his ear when I whisper to him, why don't I whisper to him to say, can we find another, meaningful way of administering these relief funds? I think it also goes back to the question you touched on, that, you see, South Africa, we are a better country. We are a better country. The problem we have is law enforcement. We know that we've got corruption. Some of the people even know the people who are doing corruption. Law enforcement also knows. We just had the state capture now. For me, those things which are mentioned in the state capture, most of us, the largest percentage of the population, knew those things. They're not new. We knew who was doing what where. Why did the law enforcement want to wait for a commission of inquiry where there was or there is a commission of a crime? Right now, over the news, I observed that there were some suggestions that why this relief fund, which is directed to KZN, why is it not given to gift of the givers to administer? Because we have never had stories so far of corruption in that NGO, and that NGO is operating internationally in other areas. In fact, let me say, it might be doing good or better than the government in terms of managing the resources. So honestly, when we have got leaders who have elected, people who have entrusted with positions and our lives and our resources, our tax money, we must just let them enjoy those benefits without accounting to us. We should run to the NGOs whilst we have got the government, we have got people who are being paid. I don't think it's the right thing to do. What we need is the reinforcement of the law enforcement agency. And I think we can address most of the problems we have in the country. I think I've dealt with one.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramatsekisa. And it appears like there are no more hands. Oh, okay. Let me take two last hands before we close. And colleagues, you'll agree with me that it's practically impossible for us to exhaust all the questions. But in the interest of time, let me take two more questions. There's a hand over there, and you'll be the last.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I have a question directed to Dr. Ramatsekisa. Don't you think that while approaching this 350 grant, the government should have considered the poverty line that we live in? Don't you think that they should have checked whether it will be sufficient for people to satisfy their basic needs or wants? And regarding the July unrest, how about this could have been affected due to the poverty people were living in? Some people were not even getting 350 grant. Could there not be this issue of July unrest? And regarding the 350 grant, couldn't the government provide some jobs or create some jobs that could have beyond the poverty line, which could have satisfied people's needs, and the poverty wouldn't have increased, and unemployment rate would have been low than now it is? And about the 350 grant, on your point of view, don't you think the inflation that occurred after the lockdown, government should have intervened, because some businesses were taking advantages, and that grant wouldn't have been sufficient for those people? So my question is that 350 grant considered after seeing the poverty line, or did they just take those decisions? Thank you.
Thank you. Watch that.
Solution to the problem. Advocate Ramatsekisa reiterated, or is two-way. But my stance, in as far as the issue is concerned, I think is the question of dealing with the procurement officials. Because the problem comes when you pay for that which you don't have. How do you pay for an incomplete product, for instance? Because once you begin to make advance payment, you remove the reason to work. That is where the problem starts. And also, perhaps the issue of hiring companies without experience. Same applies at the university level. You cannot advertise a position in criminology and you hire someone who did agriculture. That is how it works. Yeah. So there are people who are using companies but with fake qualifications that are getting the jobs. We do the roads, whereas they can fix electricity. That is what is happening. Also, when you look at the companies that are working there, they are providing jobs for many families. Once there is a tender that comes to a certain community, we have got people, they register the database of EPWP. They come and then they get employed there. The owner of the company as well must also have project managers. There are a list of staff that are employed.
I can hear you are saying we.
But what I'm trying to say is, per se, tendering system per se, there is nothing wrong. There is something wrong with when the contractor and the procurement officials start to collude. They pay before the work is done. It is happening, we know. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Advocate Dr. Ramatsekisa.
Thank you. As and when we wrap up, I can see you're concerned with the 350. You know what? I believe any person who lives in this country, you don't have to read in a book or newspaper or listen to the news about the poverty we have. We know, we live in this poverty. We're from there, Like I said, the 350 is not enough. And perhaps we should also look from where these resources are coming from. Did the government have these resources? Because that is the bigger question. Is it not being taken and redirected from somewhere to address other things? Perhaps we should start looking on this issue from that point. And I also agree with you in terms of your question, and to say, you see, we should not develop a continuous trend of endless social grants in the country. We are not going to maintain that. We should not develop a trend of the government of just giving out. It would have been better, like you're suggesting, that they should have worked something to say, okay, perhaps let's increase this money from this point to this point and employ the youth probably to fix the road or do other things. Then in that way, we'll be killing two, a stone, what do you call? Is it two birds, one stone, two birds? Because we'll be addressing the issue of poverty and also the issue of unemployment, even though it will not be, what do you call, the jobs that one could grade as high-paying jobs, but at least will be elevating poverty and at the same time doing something in terms of infrastructure or other things in the country. Because this thing of saying a person should just wake up, go and queue for money, the government that gives money is going to be a problem. That is why you find that we are lacking in other respects. I think even though the issue of the July unrest, that one was caused by several factors. If you follow it, there are political connotations inside and other things, and some were just elements of criminality. Some, remember, they will tell you that it was also pushed by the issue of the former president being arrested and so forth. So one will not exactly pinpoint to say this was the exact cause. Of course, even poverty is also amongst the cause. But I think let's wait for the outcome of the Human Rights Commission. Remember, they just did the inquiry not so long. Maybe we'll get a better sense of what actually happened. And then perhaps we can use that report in order to deal with some of these things going forward and correct ourselves. Lastly, Mr. Chidada, your comment, I entirely agree with you, and hence I said that it's a this is a multifaceted issue, the issue of tendering system. But again, what I want to emphasize from what you said, wherein companies are hired through this tendering system to deliver certain projects. And you stated it clearly that I'm a lawyer by profession. Why does government allow that a lawyer must go and tender for construction of a road? We need the engineers then. I'm not saying it in a bad way, because this is what is happening with politicians. One will take his cousin who did not even pass grade 12, register a company, go and tender for a project of 60 million, and hire a qualified engineer or an accountant or something like that. Don't you think these are some of the things we need to reflect on? What message are you sending to the youth that is going to school? And if you look at this entire thing, you will realize that this thing of tenderpreneurs just started not so long. This thing of people carrying cash around, large amount of money, it just started because of this tendering here. I don't believe that if these things were done by the right people and were done the right way, we'll be experiencing the problems we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramatsekisa. Colleagues, you'll recall that I indicated at the beginning of the public lecture that our Vice Chancellor and Principal would have loved to be here, but due to other commitments elsewhere, he could unfortunately be with us physically. But I also indicated that despite the fact that the Vice Chancellor is not here, it's following the proceedings online. And we did receive, Dr. Ramatsekisa, a text message from the Vice Chancellor and Principal, Dr. Ntambeleni, which reads, "Thank you, Dr. Ramatsekisa, for the well-presented public lecture. Most appreciated. My apologies that I was not present in person, but I followed the entire lecture online. Well done." So this is from the University Vice Chancellor, Dr. Bernard Ntambeleni. So let's give Dr. Ramatsekisa another round of applause. Colleagues, we are now moving towards the end of our public lecture, and on this note, I would like to invite to the fore one of our own, our lecturer in public law, Zama Mubai, to come and express our gratitude. So let's welcome Ms. Zama Mubai to the fore.
Thank you very much. I hope those inside you can see me. I have sometimes this tendency of being invisible whilst I'm fully standing. So I hope you can all see me. First of all, I just want to say thank you, to send our appreciation also for the message received from our Vice Chancellor. And I also want to acknowledge all of our DVCs, our registrar who received also our guest speaker this morning, and our executive dean who could not be with us, and the different faculties that are represented here. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much to all of our on-site guests or audience, and especially our online guests. I can see that you have logged in numbers. Thank you very much. Before I could even say what I want to say, because I can see people are claiming each other, I've already been claimed as a product of Advocate Ramatsekisa. This morning I was trying to confuse him that it's the other way around, but I can see that his memory is still very sharp. I was trying to convince him that he's actually my product, but he beat me to it because he still remembers the sequence very well. And I thank God that he's also been claimed by Mr. Chidada. I don't know if I should claim Miss Mawila. Maybe I can, but I can claim all of you here, most of you here. And I'm saying this because the main purpose for the lecture, the public lecture that we had today, as most of you would know, it is a build-up, the events build-up, because UNIVEN is celebrating 40 years of existence. And as one of the events, this one in particular, it's a demonstration that what UNIVEN has committed in its mission to do, it is, excuse me, it is actually doing, or it has actually done, which is to produce graduates that are locally relevant and globally competitive. And we have seen just that with our guest speaker today. And I believe that even those of you who are still students here at University of Venda, you might have been told many stories. Some of you, I'm not sure if you were here as a first choice, but look at us here today. You have seen one of our best graduates, that we do have an audience, and it is not just an ordinary audience, it's an audience where our graduates, University of Venda graduates, actually have an audience in the relevant spaces. Today, we have just been addressed by the advisor to the minister, who the minister also happens to be our graduate. So to all of our students and our alumni, University of Venda, it's indeed a university of choice, and it is producing graduates that are indeed relevant both locally and globally. So we have done a good part today in displaying the works and the quality of the University of Venda, and to show that this 40 years is not a 40 years of nothing. It is indeed a 40 years that is packed with good stories of excellence, as we have seen. And to our speaker today, he's a man of many titles, but I see now he's comfortably in his doctor title, but he is also an advocate of the High Court. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramatsekisa. I too am really proud, sorry for trying to confuse you earlier. I am really proud to be your product, and I do remember very well your passion and your diligence when you taught me introduction to the theory of law. And I think at some point also, if I'm not mistaken, constitutional law. I'm not sure whether you were tutoring or you were teaching, but we did cross paths then. And you have delivered for us a very informative lecture, something that is relevant for us. It was not just a speech just to display knowledge, and you did stick to your promise that you will be so practical, and which you have indeed delivered. We could all relate with the things that you had said. The takeout for me from your speech or from your lecture today is that we still have a long way to go in realizing and promoting the good constitution that we have. You have convinced us that indeed it is not just a beautiful paper, but it is a document of substance, and that guarantees us human rights that are relevant and which we can actually continue to rely on. You have highlighted the challenge, though, that even though the document is great, it is beautiful, it is excellent, we still need to look out for the three things that you mentioned. You said that, first of all, we need to watch out against this wolf called corruption, because it is looting. It is the one that is actually looting on the human rights. It is not that the Constitution is weak. You have also highlighted that maybe as a state, and particularly the government, the state of disaster, the pandemic, really did expose that we still need to work on, or the government rather, needs to work on the implementation. You continue to emphasize that our implementation policies, if it is at the policy level, we still have a long way to go. And that is where most of you that are still studying, perhaps you could look at that niche. How do you go out and play your part to ensure that there is proper implementation? So that we can have solid plans. We should not be caught off guard like we were during the pandemic. You mentioned that there is, maybe perhaps the reason why the lockdown levels kept on being extended is because we did not have a solid plan of recovery and coordinating what we had, and which is, for me, as an educator, as a lecturer, I'm inviting our students, our undergraduates that study along that line. Who knows, one day you will be the advisor to a proper implementation to what we already have. And it was also interesting the way you put it, that maybe we should look at our tendencies of trying to fix what is not broken, because that is also devastating us during these very challenging times. So thank you very much, and for the way you answered all of our questions. I am, for one, well satisfied in the way you handled our questions. And I want to thank all the organizers, the communication team of the university. You have done a splendid job. And again, to our program director, thank you very much for the wonderful work that you have done. And to all those that came along with Dr. Ramatsekisa, we really appreciate you. To our online viewers, thank you for joining us and staying with us, and for your interaction. We believe that you did not only listen, this also goes for our own side. You were not just here to listen, you were not just here to hear, but you were here to take out something that you could also find your space of relevance as we put University of Venda on the map and show them that this 40-year celebration is actually worth it. We are celebrating that which is tangible and that which is relevant and usable in the globe and locally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mbai. Before you take your seat, Dr. Ramatsekisa, we have been requested by the Vice Chancellor and Principal to hand over a token of appreciation. And I have also been reliably informed that this is something that you don't need to declare when you get paid. So, Ms. Mbai, could you please come to the fore and hand over the gift to our speaker. Thank you so much. This brings us to the end of our lecture. And I have one announcement to make, that lunch has been arranged. So you are all invited for lunch at the foyer of this venue. And all our colleagues from the School of Law and other staff members are invited to join Dr. Ramatsekisa for lunch in the principal's dining hall. Thank you so much.
Enda, hey, don't you move, man, more right. Hey, no, and then go with the Zaga,